You oversee obviously one of the largest ministries, in the country, if not the world. I don't want to understate it here, but it's interesting when you look at some of the statistics that show that church viewership is going down. I know that some of that had to do with the pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, that was the case. What do you feel like? And less people, by the way, the statistic I believe is 50 years ago, 90% of this country identify with being Christian. Today, it's slightly over half. So there's been a serious decline in that aspect, a decline in church attendance. And that doesn't suggest that, for some people, attendance is not necessarily related to how they feel about God or how they pursue and interact within their own faith. But what, as from someone in your position who's done this for many years, what do you think is happening there?
First of all, the latest stats coming out of Barna say that there's a great return, a mass return to church amongst millennials.
Okay.
The previous stats suggested that the nuns were taking over.
Hmm.
So there is a great return post COVID back to faith. Secondly, uh, not going to church doesn't mean that there's a lapse in faith. People ingest information differently than they did 40 years ago. If you didn't go to church, you couldn't hear the sermon. Now you can go on YouTube. Now you can stream the service in your PJs, drinking a cup of coffee. You can watch it on your phone. So the question itself leads to erroneous information because going to church isn't necessarily a physical experience anymore. There are less people going to the mall. There are less people going to the post office. There are less people going to have their taxes done at H&R Block. But that doesn't mean that they don't get their taxes done. They do it online. They do it other ways. And yes, there may be some exodus away from attending in the building or organized religion, as it were, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an exodus away from God.
So let me be a better journalist and reframe that question and say, and ask you, do you sense that there is a disconnect, or is that in what you've seen, you don't believe that that's true? Because it's often it is often frankly framed that way.
Yeah, I know it is. I know it is, but it's generally framed that way by people who are standing outside looking in. And it's like looking in your neighbor's house trying to determine what their marriage is like. From the inside looking out, I'm seeing more people than I ever saw in my life. We average some 80,000 people, 70 to 80,000 people streaming online through YouTube, through our app, through our website. I've never seen that before in all of my life, and it's global. We've got more tools to share the message. Now, there are churches that are seeing a decline and closing down. There is no monolith. When we say the church, it's always tickles me. Because what is that? The church, you know? It's like saying all black people sing. You know, that's not true. You know, I'm a witness. That's not true. Or that we all play basketball or we all eat chitlins, you know. That's not true. My kids can't stand them. Uh, we are very unique and we embrace and ingest spirituality in different ways and also at different times in our lives. It's possible to be very in tune spiritually in your 30s and not in your 40s or vice versa. And so it just depends on when you rang the phone to do the census, what the outcome becomes. I'm not worried about the church. The Bible said, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I think there'll be new generations and new voices coming up with new approaches, as there always has been for 2,000 years. And the church will evolve and take on new shapes and maybe even go back to what it was in the beginning, which wasn't about buildings at all. They continued from house to house, breaking bread and having prayer, but it was still the church. They prayed under trees. Jesus preached from a boat. Let's not narrow the church down to steeples and pews and stained glass windows. The church is not a building. It's a relationship, and I think I have found, really, to be honest with you, that sometimes that relationship exists amongst the oddest people, the most unlikely people, people that are not church people. That doesn't mean that they don't pray, and that doesn't mean that they don't talk to God and let God do the judging. But faith cannot be harnessed behind creeds, dogmas, and buildings. He never liked buildings. God never liked buildings. No building is big enough to hold him. God wants a relationship with an individual. And no matter whether we deem them Christian or deem them church people or not, that's none of our business. That's between the person and God. And I have found some of the most amazing testimonies from people, hip hop artists and people who don't go to church, or quote messages, and I think you know, and yet they'll be teary eyed in their faith, but they may not buy into a building and all that comes with a structured sociological construct that has expectations on what you wear and what you look like, and how you think. There's that group. And then there's a group that gets great strength. As the Bible said, forsaking not the assembling of yourselves together. There's that orthodox group. There's an unorthodox group. And then there are atheists and agnostics. And that's what makes our country great, is the freedom. And people jump. Atheists become believers. Believers become atheists. Agnostics become Christians, become Orthodox Jews. People jump back and forth all the time. So you can't really, it's nice to trend. It's a nice talking point. But in reality, people are quite fluid in their embracement of faith.
As we're speaking about church trends, one thing that, I have noticed, especially maybe in the last 7 to 10 years, is that church has become increasingly politicized. And where you have ministers, and I'll be very frank and very succinct with this, is that I see a lot of, not a lot, but enough, an alarming enough number of white evangelicals using their pulpit to fuse themselves further with politics, having political candidates come in and speak to congregations and all sorts of that thing. Now, we know that movements and to some degree politics, there's a very thorough history in the Black church of because it was the centerpiece of where we did everything. So in today's modern day, as someone who's heading such a large and influential ministry, how do you approach that when you see other colleagues of yours doing the opposite of what was to some degree not the intention of the church?
I could never be held accountable for what other colleagues do. I can't, that's too big of a bite for me to chew. I think that it's a careful, dangerous walk. Recently, midterm elections, I had both candidates come through. I acknowledged both candidates. I took pictures with both candidates. I let neither candidate speak. That was my way of handling it. Some people won't acknowledge them at all. Some people will give them the microphone. Every minister has to set where the boundaries are. And then we must remember that some of our congressmen are pastors. So that's a real funny thing to try to figure out what is and is not appropriate when you've got people in Congress who are preachers. I can say the blowback is fierce when you start saying that God wants this person to be senator or president or congressman. The blowback is fierce and dangerous and lethal and detrimental because how do we really know that? And then when it blows up, sometimes we lose credibility because we have gone from preaching Jesus to preaching people. And people always fail you. All people fail you. And I think it's a safer thing to preach Jesus and let people vote how. I tell my church all the time, you can read now. You don't need me to tell you. You can research. You can Google. You got a phone. I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I'm telling you on the blood of our ancestors, your voice needs to be heard. If we're the salt of the earth, we have to engage the culture and be involved. And one of those ways is through voting. But getting down into telling them how to vote, which might have been helpful when they couldn't read. But today, I don't know that there's anybody in my church that can't read or think. And so they don't come to me to decide what is obvious. And I don't do that. But as for my colleagues, as for white evangelicals, and I don't want to put them all in a bag. I think some of them went to extremes, and they'll have to answer those questions themselves. Others were more moderate. Here's the thing you have to always remember: only the extremes get printed about. So in any group of people, it's always the plane that crashes that makes the news, not the one that lands. There are a lot of churches that have stayed out of the fray or been very moderate and measured in how they approach it. But who's going to do a story on that? They're only going to do a story about the extreme, and then we're going to make an overall blanket statement about the whole based on the extreme.